Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you so much for joining me for another true crime video. I hope you guys are all having an amazing day so far. Today we are talking about week 3 of the Karen Read trial. Now I am a little bit behind. I had some family stuff going on, so I am trying to keep this relatively in sequence. So we'll be talking about week 3 today. Now, thankfully, week 4 and week 5 are relatively short. I think they're only in session for a couple of days of those weeks. So I will be able to catch up. Now, I am all caught up when it comes to watching the trial. I know everything that's going on up to date. It's just when it comes to filming, I'm trying to keep this all in sequence. But man, this case has just got my head spinning. I so much of it, I'm just like, my jaw is on the floor. It's just unbelievable. And I know with a case like this, it's just inevitable that at some point this case is going to be made into a movie. And one of the things that makes this case so crazy, like normally for a typical trial, we have the prosecution kind of putting forth their theory and the defense kind of poking holes in that theory, just enough to give some reasonable doubt. However, with this case, we have the prosecution trying to prove their theory that Karen Read hit John O'Keefe, while at the same time trying to disprove what the defense is saying. Whereas the defense is trying to kind of prove that there is this large cover up or conspiracy while disproving that Karen Read is responsible. So it's like we have these two separate theories going on, and there's just a lot of information. Now, in my personal opinion, I think that the prosecution's strategy, or at least what seems to be their strategy, seems to be a little bit flawed. And this is just coming from me. I am nobody special. I'm not an expert in any stretch of the imagination. However, it seems like they are spending more of their time and resources trying to disprove the defense's theory rather than prove that Karen Read is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And from where I'm sitting, as I watch this kind of unfold, I just don't see their strategy working. Now, again, we're just about halfway through this trial. So who knows what they have up their sleeve? There can be something that is just game changing. However, I will say that looking at week 4, I did start to view this case differently. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what. That will be discussed in my next video. With the defense's strategy, there are some points that, in my perception, it seems like they're trying to push things too far. And for the defense, it's important for them to be reading the jury. Now, from where we're sitting, we don't really know how the jury's reacting. We can't see their facial expressions or anything like that. But it's hard for us as outsiders to really gauge how the jury is reacting to all of this. But as I'm viewing this, it just seems like sometimes they might come off as overly aggressive when it's not really necessary. Now, I can be completely off base. Perhaps the jury is right there with the defense, kind of feeling the same things that they are, but juries are notoriously unpredictable. So who really knows what they're thinking at this point? So let's go ahead and dive in to week 3 of the Karen Read trial because there is a lot to unpack. Week 3 started off with the cross-examination of Brian Albert, the homeowner or former homeowner of the 34 Fairview residence. It seems as if Brian Albert just so happened to upgrade his phone just a day before a court issued a preservation order. Now, a preservation order essentially just means do not delete, alter, or otherwise manipulate your phone in any way. So he upgraded his phone just days before this order. And while some information transfers over, such as contacts, pictures, text messages, things like that, there is certainly other information that will be lost. Such information like data showing when a phone is locked, when it's opened, how it's opened, if it's using a PIN or facial recognition, it'll show movements of that phone. So all of that data was lost when he upgraded his phone. So him not having that physical phone, a lot of that data is unrecoverable. And one of the main points of contention is that we were able to see a phone call between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins around 2:22 a.m. the night slash morning of John O'Keefe's death. But Brian Albert's explanation for this call essentially was that he and his wife both sleep with their phones in their bed with them, like not on a nightstand on a charger, but actually in the bed with them. And to explain this 222 call, he explains that he and his wife, Nicole Albert, were engaging in some frisky activities while they were in bed, and somehow he was able to butt dial Brian Higgins. And throughout the coming days of testimony, we hear in upwards of 10 butt dials in that same time period, coincidentally, none of them leaving voicemails. One from Brian Albert to Brian Higgins, one from Brian Higgins back to Brian Albert, and several from Jen McCabe to John O'Keefe, which I personally have a very, very hard time believing. As the defense pointed out, not only would you have to use some form of unlocking the phone, whether by PIN or by facial recognition, but you would also have to use something to end the call before it reached voicemail. So, in my personal opinion, if I were on that jury, I would have a very, very hard time believing this story. Now, both Brian Albert and Brian Higgins denied having any type of conversation around that 2:22 a.m. time period. But again, it'll be up to the jury as to whether or not they believe that. After Brian Albert's testimony, we then get into the testimony of Brian Albert Jr. and Caitlin Albert, the two children of Brian Albert and Nicole Albert. So Brian Jr. was celebrating his birthday, so he had some friends over at the 34 Fairview residence, when then later the group from the waterfall would join them just after midnight. We would then hear from a number of people who were at that party that night, including Brian Jr.'s friends, Julie Nagel and Sarah Levinson. Now, during that night, Julie's brother came to the house to pick her up, although she decided to stay longer. Now, her brother was in a vehicle, I believe it was a Ford F-150, with his friend who was driving and his former girlfriend who was sitting in the back seat. Now, several people who were inside the house that night testified to looking outside a number of different times. I'd say amongst them over a dozen times, claiming that they saw Karen Reed's SUV. In addition to the people inside the house, Julie Nagel's brother, who was outside in the car, along with his friend and his then girlfriend, also testified to seeing the SUV. Now, as the three of them were driving away from the home, they did witness a woman sitting in the driver's seat, but they didn't recall a man in the SUV with her. Now, while this group inside of the Ford F-150, the three individuals, and all those that were inside the house that night, those who were looking outside, they all mentioned seeing the SUV outside, mentioning that they saw it move a few times. However, their inconsistencies begin where the location of the SUV initially was. Some people suggest that the SUV started off in front of the mailbox and moved up a number of times. However, others say that there was a Jeep in front of the mailbox and the SUV was in front of the Jeep. Now, I will add that this Jeep, which belongs to Brian Higgins, also has a snowplow attached to the front of it, which to me would be a very distinct vehicle that would be hard to miss. Some claimed that they also saw tire tracks leading up to the SUV, while others say that they didn't see tire tracks at all. Now, one thing that all of these testimonies had in common was that nobody saw this SUV driving in an unsafe manner. Nobody saw this SUV go in reverse. Nobody saw this SUV hit anything or anybody. Nobody heard any commotion. Nobody heard any tires squealing. Nobody saw anything that looked remotely out of the ordinary. And from coming and going from that house, nobody saw a 6'2" man laying on the lawn. And this is a huge part of the defense's theory. How is it possible that out of the dozen or so times that people were looking out of the window at different times, but around the same time that John O'Keefe was allegedly hit by Karen Reed, nobody saw anything? Not a single person saw anything that looked suspicious? How is it that nobody saw this large man just 10 or 15 feet away from them lying there on the ground? And as they were leaving, all of them testified to leaving in the direction of where John O'Keefe's body was found. And if they're pulling out of the driveway or going forward, their headlights would be shining on the area where John O'Keefe's body was found. It just seems a little bit too unbelievable to me. Now, Julie Nagel did testify that as Jen and Matt McCabe were driving her and Sarah home, she noticed a black blob on the lawn near the flagpole, and she claimed that she mentioned something about it in the car. However, she had so much to drink, she kind of just brushed it off. Now, this was reported in a police report. However, it wouldn't be until months and months later, which again just seems so unrealistic to me. How is it that she noticed this black blob? She even mentioned that she put two and two together, but you didn't think to report it to police, that this could help their investigation? Not to mention, don't you think she would at least mention it to Brian Jr.? This is one of her very close friends. And his father is a police officer, and she didn't think to mention it. It just doesn't seem plausible to me. Furthermore, during her testimony, she claimed that this black blob was 5 or 6 feet in length. And this is the first time that she would ever give that description of this black blob or this black object. It does not seem reasonable that she would not think to offer that information earlier. Now, all of the people who were at the 34 Fairview residence that night, at least the ones who have testified so far, have all been consistent in their testimonies that nobody else was there other than the ones who have already been identified, and nobody saw John O'Keefe enter the house. Now, this is a huge part of the prosecution's theory as to how all of these individuals would remain consistent on that very fact. How likely or unlikely would it be that all of these people would lie about John O'Keefe never entering the home? If John O'Keefe ever did, at least one of these people would have cracked. But from my perspective, what I found interesting was how these testimonies just seemed a little bit too similar. It seems as if at a normal gathering, this large with this many people, there would be a little bit more variation, because what one person is experiencing in the kitchen is going to be obviously a little bit different from someone who is in the living room. Maybe the parties that I go to are different, but with a group that large, where people are drinking, they're dancing, they're having their own conversations, they wouldn't know what every person in the house is doing at all times. But within all of the testimonies of the people who were there that night, they were all drinking a substantial amount, dancing, having conversations, but yet all of them seemed to know that Brian Higgins and Brian Albert were in a specific part of the house looking at photos. And it just doesn't seem realistic to me that everyone knew what they were doing. For me, in my experience, if I'm at a party and there's a lot of people and we're drinking and dancing and having a good time, having our own conversations, I'm not really focused, or I'm not particularly paying attention to what other people are doing in a completely different location of the house, right? I don't know. It just seems weird to me. Then finally, we heard from the first expert witness. This witness came out of UC Davis and seemed to specialize in animal DNA testing. Now, this is one of those parts of the trial that is a hot debate because of the injuries found on the inside of John O'Keefe's arm, whereas many people believe they are more consistent with animal scratches or animal bites. During the direct examination, the prosecution alluded to her testing some DNA that was found on a t-shirt. Now, as of right now, there has been no evidence admitted suggesting whose t-shirt this was or where on the t-shirt was swabbed. So none of those details have been put into evidence yet. This witness was essentially just sent some swabs that were collected, and she tested them. And while they did not test positive for dog DNA, they did, however, test positive for pig DNA. Now, I know the side that believes that Karen Reed is guilty believes that this testimony was explosive for the prosecution. I have to disagree because as we get into the cross examination, we see that we have no idea whose shirt this is at the moment. We have no idea when it was collected, where it was collected, where it was swabbed. For instance, if it was just swabbed over here on the shoulder, that does not say what the 90% of the shirt might have said. Furthermore, the defense also questioned this witness about the proper protocol when it comes to protecting the chain of custody to make sure that the integrity of this evidence is intact. The defense then pushed the envelope a little here when they asked this witness if a red solo cup would be an appropriate receptacle for collecting DNA, which this witness literally responded, "I'm sorry, what?" And while the objection to this question was sustained, I imagine that it would still leave quite an impression on the jury. Later, we got into the testimonies of Allison or Allie McCabe and Colin Albert. Now, these two witnesses are around the same age, and obviously their families are very close. So while they are not blood related, they are essentially like family, and they do consider each other their best friends. Now, Allie McCabe testified to picking up Colin from the Albert residence around 12:10 a.m., which would have been before John O'Keefe ever arrived. Now, her testimony to when she picked up Colin Albert is consistent with everyone else that was in the residence at that time, saying that Colin Albert was leaving the residence just as the people from the waterfall were arriving. During the cross examination of Allie, the defense put forth some Life 360 data, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Life 360 is an app that many parents use to kind of track their children, know where they are, know how fast they're driving and where they're headed, and all of that type of information. Now, we haven't seen any expert testimony as to how accurate or reliable this app is. However, the underlying message of the defense's questioning was that this Life 360 data showed Allie driving around 1:30 a.m., which would be very inconsistent with her testimony. Now, as I discussed in my previous videos, nobody had put Colin Albert at that residence or mentioned picking him up until months later. And this was a huge issue that the defense brought up as to why nobody would have mentioned him being there. Now, on redirect, Allie was asked why she never mentioned picking up Colin was ever reported or why they didn't find it to be relevant, to which she explained it wasn't until after the public outrage and the Free Karen Reed movement were harassing her family, explaining that they were sending her threatening calls, emails, emailing their school, showing up at sporting events, and things like that. Now, there was a comment that Allie made during her testimony that, like many testimonies, have multiple interpretations. But listen to what she said.
Colin wasn't at the house, so he's being harassed for, he was not at the house when John was there, so I drove him home.
Now, could this have been just an innocent slip of the words, or was it a Freudian slip? Does it mean that Colin wasn't there when the SUV with John O'Keefe was there, or does it mean that John O'Keefe was inside of the residence? Ultimately, that will be up for the jury to decide. Now, after Allie, we get into the testimony of Colin Albert, who, if you remember, is one of the third-party culprits in the defense's theory. Now, even during his direct examination, Colin Albert didn't really seem to remember much. I want to say the vast majority of his answers were, "I don't remember." However, he did specifically remember that Allie picked him up at 12:10. He remembers being driven home and then going upstairs and speaking to his parents, which is consistent with their respective testimonies. Now, on cross-examination, it was uncovered and revealed to the jury that Colin Albert happened to be the ring bearer for Trooper Michael Proctor's sister, Courtney Proctor. And let me remind you that Trooper Proctor was the lead investigator in this case. Now, we've seen testimony showcasing the very close relationship between Julie Albert and Courtney Proctor. So this really aligns with the defense's theory of this being a very close circle, the Alberts and the McCabes, and now the Proctors. Now, whether or not you believe this is just some huge conspiracy or a cover up, I think we should all agree at the very least that Trooper Proctor should not have been involved in this case for this exact reason. The jury was then shown some photos of Colin Albert, one specifically just weeks after John O'Keefe's death, showing him with some very obvious wounds or healing wounds on his knuckles. The jury also heard two videos of Colin Albert that he took himself. It looks to be something like on Snapchat, where he is threatening to fight a group of boys, claiming that he'd them up, telling them to pull up, showing that Colin Albert may not be this innocent kid as he portrayed.
Yo, your band's boys, I will beat all your asses. I promise you, I'll fuck you all up. Pull up, bitch. You're a bitch, bro. Fuck you. Yeah, fuck you, pussy. You go, boy, you be knocked out. KO. Bang, bang.
On redirect, Colin Albert seems to have some epiphany and his memory is restored as to what happened to cause his knuckles to be injured. Now, according to his story, he claims that he was walking up an icy driveway. He had either a beverage or perhaps his cell phone in his left hand. He then slipped and then caught himself as he put his right knuckles down to catch his fall, to which the defense kind of spoke for all of us when he asked, "Really?" It was also revealed that sometime later during a grand jury, Colin Albert arrived with scab knuckles once again. Now, this time he explained that that injury was due to him hitting a punching bag without any type of wrap or gloves to protect his hands, which this seems much more plausible. I do find it weird how it would only be on one hand, specifically since he mentioned that he is as equally as strong with his left and right hand. But that does seem more plausible of an explanation as to how you can get wounds on your knuckles. Now, week 3 of the Karen Read trial was closed by the testimonies of Matt and Jen McCabe. Much of their testimonies, when it came to what was going on at the waterfall, as to when they left the waterfall and headed to the Albert residence, was consistent with everybody else. Everyone was seeming to have a great night. There was no tension, no fighting. But once they reached the point to about 12:20, this is when it seems to get chaotic and things stop making sense. According to both of their testimonies, Jen was driving her and Matt McCabe to the Albert residence when John had called asking for directions. Now, both of them seem to have been relaying these directions over a Bluetooth speaker that was on their car so they can both hear what was going on. And while Matt and Jen McCabe arrived to the residence first, they both testified to seeing the SUV pull up shortly after. Both Matt and Jen were a part of the group who testified to looking out the window multiple times. Now, Matt said that he thought it was weird that they were outside for so long and nobody had come in, while Jen was texting John, first telling him to pull behind their vehicle, and then saying that the following text messages, she would look out the window while texting, wondering why they weren't coming in. Now, both Matt and Jen McCabe are two of the few people who placed Brian Higgins' Jeep in front of the mailbox, saying that the SUV was in front of this Jeep. Now, it hasn't been made super clear to me as to the significance of this Jeep being there. However, I think that the inconsistencies are worth noting. Now, what I find to be so odd about Matt and Jen McCabe's testimonies is that at this point, they claim to have been friends of John and Karen, but yet when they see this SUV out there for 10, 15 minutes, neither of them go outside to welcome them in. Like, hey guys, come on inside, or like see what's going on. I don't know. Maybe I'm looking too much into it. It just seems weird to me. Now, Matt and Jen McCabe both claimed that after they left the residence, they dropped off Julie Nagel and Sarah off of their house. They then drove home, went upstairs, and went to sleep. However, Jen did mention that at some point she was Googling stuff when it came to I think it was a hockey team, ice hockey, something like that. And then they went to bed. Matt McCabe was awoken hours later to the screams of Karen Reed on the phone. Jen McCabe had received a call from Karen Reed just before 5 a.m., where both Matt and Jen testified that Karen was screaming hysterically, repeating Jen's name and telling them that John O'Keefe never made it home. Now, just a short time later, Karen drives to Jen McCabe's house so they can go out and look for John O'Keefe together. Now, a part of Matt McCabe's testimony that really stuck out to me was that he made a statement that Karen Reed was screaming so loudly, he basically told her to shut up because she was going to wake up the whole neighborhood. Interestingly, as we heard in previous testimony, was that Karen Reed screaming hysterically didn't seem to wake up anybody in the 34 Fairview household. Then, during the cross examination of Matt McCabe, a number of group text messages were revealed consisting of Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, Nicole Albert, and Brian Albert. And if you forgot, Jen McCabe and Nicole Albert are sisters. Now, these text messages showed details being discussed of when police were kind of surveying the neighborhood and talking to neighbors. It was shown how Matt was attempting to take pictures and kind of report it back to Brian Albert, which obviously looks a little bit suspicious. And what I found to be very interesting in this was how Brian Albert seemed to be more interested in the police who were surveying his neighborhood, yet he was not interested enough to even exit his house the morning in question to see what was going on outside on his lawn. And then perhaps one of the biggest moments for the defense so far was a text message to Chris Albert from Matt McCabe saying, quote, "Tell them the guy never went in the house."
You texted the group chat to say, ask Chris to ask some questions, correct?
Yep, I'm reading it right now. Yes, that's correct.
And who was the Chris you were referring to?
That would be Chris Albert.
Brian's brother, correct?
That is correct.
And then you texted your wife, Brian Albert, and Nicole Albert, quote, "Tell them the guy never went in the house," correct?
Yeah, that's part of the same text. Yes.
Mr. McCabe, who was the guy that you were referring to? Does he have a name?
That would be John O'Keefe.
When you told the group to tell them the guy never went in the house, that was you talking about how you should all get your stories straight, correct?
No.
You would agree with me that your stories are all straight in terms of the guy never went in the house, correct?
Objection.
Can you answer that?
John never went in the house. It's not a story, it's a fact.
Well, when you said, tell them the guy never went in the house, Brian Albert was on that exchange still, was he not? He was still part of the group text?
Yes, Brian is on the exchange.
And Brian Albert was the one to respond, wasn't he?
Let me switch pages here. 51.
He responded, did he not?
Yes, he did.
And then at that point, you knew Brian Albert was the oldest brother of the Albert family, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The oldest sibling in that family, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in his response to your instructions that his younger brother, Chris, should say that John O'Keefe never went in the house, or the guy never went in the house, you would agree with me that he responded with one word, correct?
Yes, he did.
And in response to you saying the guy never went in the house, Brian Albert's response was, exactly, correct?
Yes, that's his response.
All right, we're done here.
Now, on redirect, prosecution loudly asked Matt McCabe who was them, as in tell them he never went inside. Who was them? To which Matt McCabe explained that it was a local news station interviewing Chris Albert. Now, again, with the defense's theory in mind, this can certainly look like this group was essentially getting their story straight. Why would it be necessary to direct Chris to tell the interviewer that John never went inside if that was the truth in the matter? Furthermore, referring to John O'Keefe as the guy just came off eerily cold, and in my personal opinion, almost seems as if they are trying to intentionally be discreet by not even using his name, especially considering that John O'Keefe was supposed to be their friend, right? And I can't imagine that anybody would call their recently deceased friend as the guy. Now, the week ended with the direct examination of Jen McCabe, who, in my personal opinion, seems to be really the Commonwealth's star witness. She was at the waterfall that night at the very beginning. She was at the house when she saw the SUV arrive. She was communicating with John that night, and she was there the morning of when they would ultimately uncover John O'Keefe's body. Jen McCabe detailed that morning, at first Karen calling her hysterical, screaming her name over and over and over, saying that John had never come home. At some point, Karen then goes to Jen McCabe's house as they had plans to go out and look for John O'Keefe together. Now, at one point, the two of them also met up with Carrie Roberts, who didn't really seem to be friends of Karen or Jen. However, she seemed to be very close friends with John O'Keefe. Jen talked a lot about how hysterical Karen was, how she was repeating the same things over and over, how she was screaming Jen's name over and over, as well as Carrie's. She even mentioned at some point, Carrie Roberts basically said that Karen Reed was batshit crazy. During her testimony, Jen McCabe also recalls Karen Reed making the same types of statements, saying, "Did I hit him or could I have hit him?" over and over and over. Now, early in the morning, they first decided to go back to John O'Keefe's house. One, because they would only take one vehicle together. So they were dropping off Karen Reed's SUV. And they also wanted to go back into the house to look around to make sure that John O'Keefe was not in the house anywhere. Now, Lowley asked Jen McCabe when they got to John O'Keefe's house and they got out of their respective vehicles what had happened, to where Jen explains that Karen Reed said, "Look, I must have hit him. Look at my cracked taillight." However, as the prosecution showed the footage to the jury, we don't see this happen, not even for a split second did they ever seem to even look at the taillight. And I think this was a huge mistake for the prosecution, which they never really seemed to clear up. Now, in this footage, we do see how the three of them then went into John's house. However, they did not find him there. So then they decided to go to 34 Fairview. On the way there, Carrie is driving. Jen McCabe is in the passenger seat while Karen Reed is in the back seat. At this point, Jen is saying that Karen is still panicking. She's screaming, but at the same time mentions how she keeps looking at her phone while texting. As Carrie Roberts approaches the Fairview residence, Jen McCabe suggests that Karen Reed was quickly able to spot John O'Keefe's body, whereas Jen McCabe wasn't really able to see his body as he was covered in snow, but it seemed as if Karen Reed knew exactly where he was. And with the prosecution's theory in mind, if Karen Reed truly did hit John O'Keefe, it would be easy for her to know exactly where he would be. Shortly thereafter, when the paramedics arrived, they began questioning Karen Reed about John O'Keefe. And this is when Jen McCabe claims of hearing Karen Reed state, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Now, this statement is consistent with the paramedic that we heard earlier in this trial, Katie McLaughlin. However, that was the testimony that the defense was trying to get impeached, as she seems to have close ties with the Alberts as well. Additionally, the statements that Karen Reed made have been widely debated since the beginning of this trial, as others claimed that it was more of a question. Did I hit him or could I have hit him? Which really brings into question if she had really made that admission. At the end of her direct testimony, Jen McCabe claims that Karen Reed asked her to Google things about hypothermia or how long it would take to die in the cold. Now, the redirect for Jen McCabe would happen that following Monday, which I will discuss in my next video. But according to Jen McCabe's testimony, they were all at the waterfall that night. They were all having a great time. When they went back to the Fairview residence, nobody saw anything go on. She does claim that Karen told her that Karen and John were having a fight. And Karen doesn't remember even going to the Fairview residence. She remembered dropping John off at the waterfall. And while she was panicked and frantic, she was insistent that they go back to the Fairview residence to look for John. And while Jen McCabe says that she was unable to see John O'Keefe's body, somehow Karen was able to know exactly where he was. And that's where we'll leave off. Now, next week, we'll get into the cross examination of Jen McCabe, and perhaps one of the biggest pieces of evidence for the defense when they revealed data showing that Jen McCabe searched House Long to Die in Cold at 2:27 a.m. So it's going to be wild. This case is certainly unique. I cannot stop watching it. And I feel like as days go on, my head is just spinning. And it's crazy how polarizing this case is. Whether you believe Karen Read is guilty, whether you believe she is innocent, or whether you're just trying to stay neutral, you will be attacked for your views by the crazies on each side. Now, for me, at this point, I haven't seen anything to suggest a guilty verdict. Now, that doesn't mean that she's innocent. It means that it hasn't been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Additionally, like I mentioned in my previous videos, they also have to prove intent. And I think at this point, if she had hit him, it looks as if it would have been an accident. I don't see how they can get to the intent. We haven't gotten to the majority of the expert testimonies, the pathologist, the medical examiner, all of those types of things. So I'm still keeping an open mind. But I will say if Karen Read is truly guilty, if she really did hit John O'Keefe, whether intentional or not, she certainly lucked out that out of all of the people who were in the house that night or by the house, in front of the house, driving by the house, nobody saw her hit him. Nobody saw his body. There were no cameras. And it just so happens that the investigation was completely botched and there were all of these conflicts of interest. The fact that all of these things would occur to make it even a question as to whether or not that she's guilty is unbelievable. What are the chances of that? It just seems like there are an awful lot of coincidences. And for me, I'm just really not a big believer in coincidences. But that's just my opinion. I want to hear what you guys think. After week 3, are you leaning more towards guilty or not guilty? What are your thoughts about all of these people walking just a few yards away from John O'Keefe's body and nobody seeing him? What do you think about Karen Read being able to find John O'Keefe's body as he was covered in snow? Or what do you think about the Google search being done at 2:27? Again, we haven't gotten into that yet, but we know it's coming. I'm dying to hear what you guys think. So let me know all of your thoughts and theories down below. Make sure you like this video before you go, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.